Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Great Books program for 2023. I'm Jim Garrison, and along with my distinguished colleague, the Dean of Graduate Studies, Georgie Szabo, we delight each year in picking new books and inviting colleagues to talk about their favorite books for our graduate seminar in this course that meets once a month, like many graduate seminars. I want to begin today, as I try to each year, just to summarize the nature of a great book. Because there's been millions of books printed, but only a few of them are considered great. I think a great book has the following characteristics. First of all, a great book is a book that deals with noble subjects. It's not a gossip column. It's not trivia. When we encounter a great book, it's because we encounter a treatment of a subject, a domain, like love or justice, history, archetypal unfoldments that are universal, that speak to people everywhere, no matter what language and no matter what culture. A great book, because it's dealing with noble subjects, subjects of gravitas, speaks to people in very diverse corners of the world. Just think of Shakespeare. People in China read Shakespeare. Think of the Quran. People all over the world read the Quran, read the Bible, read the Analects, read the Tao Te Ching. These books have been translated into scores, hundreds of languages, and they endure over time because they speak to people over time. And I think another fundamental characteristic of a great book is that a great book transforms lives. People have been powerfully transformed by reading Jalaluddin Rumi's poetry, or reading the Bible, or reading the Analects, reading the Bhagavad Gita. A book like the Bhagavad Gita, for example, which is just a small part of a much larger epic, the Mahabharata. And yet it's that small little chapter, the Bhagavad Gita, that seized India and seized people in the search for a deeper spirituality around the world and across time, and has done so in a way that transforms their lives. So when one encounters a great book, one encounters an intelligence not your own, codified in words. We often think of intelligence as a person, like me, like you, like your friend, like your father, your brother, your wife, your husband. We think of intelligence as embodied in a biology. But intelligence is embodied in everything in the whole universe. So when you have a great book, you have a distillation of consciousness by an intelligence encoded in language that then lasts forever. I had an experience of this just this last weekend, actually. I have two sons, and they came over to where Claire and I live with their, one's married to a woman and the other one's living with another woman. So they were all in the house together, and every year around Christmas to New Year's, we consult the I Ching. And all 6 of us consulted the I Ching. And it was extraordinary that with every toss of the coins, the oracle spoke deeply, personally, and specifically to each of us 6 people. Very different in our lives, very different in our interests, very different in our stage of growth and development. And the kids were astonished. And they said, how can this happen? How does a book from ancient China, written well over 3,000 years ago, how does it know me? How does me putting the coins in my hand elicit a bit of wisdom from a book? But it does. And that's what makes these great books great. They endure over time. They're dealing with noble subjects, and they transform lives. So each year we try to choose books that are influencing us in one way or another. Some are ancient, some are modern, some are from the West, some are from the East, some are poetry, some are prose. And this year we have a wonderful series of books. And this year we're going to be having several of our presenters as our current doctoral students. You know, Georgie has built up such an extraordinary PhD program. I consider it probably the best in the world. I would put our PhD program against Harvard or Columbia or any other school anywhere. They're basically primitive. They are basically left brain exercises in objective knowledge. But that's just a sliver of how people know what they know. Howard Gardner at Harvard, for example, has discerned that we have at least 9 or 10, maybe a dozen different kinds of intelligences. So all of our prevailing academic institutions choose one little way of knowing, and they make that the totality. That's one reason why the world is in such bad shape. But at Ubiquity, we honor all kinds of ways of knowing. We have what we call the subject-object synthesis. We want to know that you know what the subject is about. But we also want to know how you're being moved by your subject. And that is how Ubiquity has distinguished itself. So this year, we're going to profile some of our stellar doctoral students who have chosen books, so that you can see all of that in the syllabus. But I chose the book that I did by Tim Marshall called Prisoners of Geography, after talking with Georgie, actually, who was excited about it and read it and said that I absolutely had to go out and get it. And so I did, and I read it, and it's built around 10 maps that he says, in a little bit of an overstatement, kind of determine everything. I don't think that's altogether true. But the essential point that Tim Marshall is making in his book, Prisoners of Geography, is that while we're running around trading, warring, communicating, living our lives, we think that we are autonomous beings. And he says to some degree to some degree we are, but at a deeper degree we are not. We're shaped by our culture. We're shaped by our language, and that emanates from our geography. And he makes several points in his book that I think are very salient within this context. He said, for example, in understanding the United States, he says, geographically is probably the most favored area in the entire world. I hadn't taken that in until I read the book. But if you look at the geography, which I did really for the first time, the way the United States is structured, just geographically, would predict that whatever people inhabited that land would become great. First of all, it's protected by 2 oceans on either side, so it can't be attacked, essentially. If you're living in Germany, for example, you're being attacked all the time. If you're living in Ukraine, you're being attacked all the time. Empires sweep across. I'm from Sicily on my mother's side. Poor Sicily, boy. The geography of Sicily there at the boot of Italy, every imperial system has swept over Sicily since time immemorial. There's no autonomy for Sicily. It's a captive it's a prisoner of its geography. The United States, with its vast river systems, and the extraordinary plains and the fertility and all of that, is conducive to a great outcome. On the other hand, Africa is one of the most geographically challenged places on Earth. So it's not surprising, according to Tim Marshall, that Africa has never attained any kind of greatness, because its geography mitigates against it. It has very few ports. One of the biggest continents in the world, there's almost no ports for deep port, for ocean trading. And the river systems don't connect. And you have 1 or 2 great river systems like the Nile in northern Africa. But beyond that, Africa is significantly challenged. So is South America. So that what Tim Marshall says about South America is similar, that it is so geographically challenged that it's not surprising that it never united. And that was the dream of Simon Bolivar, in the early 1800s, the 1820s and 30s, as he was leading one war of independence after another for the Spain. He said, let's be like the United States. Let's unite as one Latin American country. And it never happened, according to Tim Marshall, because of geography. The Andes Mountain, the Amazon River Basin, there's no way for the people in that area of the world to naturally unite. You look at China and the great Himalayan rooftop of the world, and the great river systems, and how the rivers that have come out of the Himalayas have influenced China, with the Yangtze River and the Huang River, and in India, the Ganges River, the Indus River, the Zaraputra River, these great river basins that emanate out of the melting ice of the great mountains of the Himalayan plateau. And that geography determines China, determines India, and the cultures that have grown up in those areas are the cultures that have been able to attune themselves to the geography the most adeptly. And so that's the basic thesis of Tim Marshall in this book, and it's well worth reading. I wouldn't say the book is great, I would say it's great because of its relevance to the world today. And within that context, I want to focus on the geography of one particular country, which Tim Marshall touches on, but only in passing, because at the time that he wrote the book, the war in Ukraine had not broken out. But one of his maps is the map of Europe. And he talks about how the geography of sort of Middle Europe is a geography of the steppes, a geography of flatlands, and the great flatlands of Ukraine going up Europe. There are mountain ranges to be sure, but largely the European landmass is mostly flat till it gets to the Urals, and then it's mostly flat all the way to the Pacific. So it's an area of the world which, like the Middle East, because of its geography, is particularly suited to invasion and migration and cross-fertilization of peoples as they move easily, unlike in Latin America, unlike in Africa, to conquer each other, to trade with each other, and so forth. And he points out, for example, that one of the reasons why Europe became the engine for colonialism and as strong as it did is because the river systems interlace. So you can go over most parts of Europe, at least traditionally, just on the river system. Just think of the great Danube river system. And there's many ports. Think of Hamburg, think of London, think of, all the Mediterranean, all the different ports around the Mediterranean, and so forth. So this is something that we should just bear in mind about what it is that we're living in. And within this context, I wanted to focus, as I said, on what's going on in Ukraine. Because what's going on in Ukraine, as you may know from my other lectures and my blog and my teach-in on Ukraine, is, to my mind, the most dangerous situation that the world has been in my lifetime. And certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when we almost went to nuclear war. And so I'd like to talk about Ukraine now, but from the point of view, not of politics, but of geography. Because I think that if we understand the geography of Ukraine, and we understand how the geopolitics of the last 30 years have interfaced with geography, we'll understand more clearly why the situation is so dangerous and what the possibilities are to bring peace. It all comes out of the map. So I want to share my screen, start with. And this is Ukraine. And this is one flat area that is known as the breadbasket of Europe. Currently, it's the largest country in Europe by several orders of magnitude. And it is a new country. As I mentioned, one of the characteristics of Ukraine, since it's been a crossroads from the very beginning. In fact, the word Ukraine means crossroad, means border, is that it's been invaded and reinvaded and colonized and subjugated and liberated and then subjugated again for thousands of years. In fact, Ukraine did not become an independent country until 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And I want to just point out something that's very important for us to understand about this war. If you watch any of the mass media, Putin and the Russians invaded Ukraine to take over Ukraine and to proceed to take over Eastern Europe because Putin has these delusions of grandeur about greater Russia and so forth and so on. Nothing could be farther from the truth. What the mass media has been telling all of us about Ukraine is purely there to serve the war machine in the United States, as I'll seek to demonstrate over the next few minutes, even though this lecture is primarily about geography. But if you look at what the Russians have done in Ukraine, they haven't invaded Ukraine. What they've done is secured a land bridge to Crimea. They're prisoners of geography. Crimea has been in the possession of Russia since 1783 and Catherine the Great. It had Crimea multiple times before that, but given the vicissitudes of all the empires, the Ottomans and the Byzantines and the Arabs and so forth and so on, the various tribal groups in that area, the Turks, it got it and then lost it again and again until finally in 1783 it reasserted, and in fact it had all of Ukraine. So Russia controlled Ukraine from the beginning, actually, because Russia, the kingdom of Rus, started in Ukraine and then migrated to the east and then to the north. But this is ancestral territory. And so when you look at the map and you see what Russia has done as a great power, it is essential that Russia controlled Crimea. Why? Geography. Crimea and this land bridge, this is Russia here, gives Russia now access to the Black Sea. The Black Sea pours into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean empties out to the Atlantic. So by controlling this land bridge, Russia controls a vital access to a very strategically important part of the world. If Russia did not have this land, it would have no access to the Mediterranean. The only other access would be up north in the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea. And that's mostly under ice most of the year. So Russia, for centuries, has always had the geographic necessity of a land bridge to Crimea. That's very important to understand. I want to now show you a couple more maps so you understand more clearly why Russia last February seized this territory and reclaimed this ancestral land. Because if we understand the larger geographical context, we'll understand why the war came about, why Russia did what it did, and what, therefore, the solutions are to this conflict. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to start right here with a map. Again, here's the map of Europe. This is a map of Europe in 1990. So it's just over 30 years ago, about 33 years ago. And you'll remember, if you go back to that period of time in 1989, November, the Berlin Wall came down. And at that time, the United States controlled Western Europe through NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Treaty Organization. The Soviet Union had taken Eastern Europe after Germany in 1941 had invaded, caused unspeakable carnage and death to some 27 million people as a result of that war. And so in 1943, 44, and 45, the Soviet Union swept west, while the United States and Britain swept east. And they met right along this border. And that split Germany up. East Berlin was, or Berlin was here, and they split Germany up because they said that Germany was too strong and needed to be broken up and monitored, given the fact that they had brought war to Europe twice in the first half of the 20th century. And then in 1989, 1985 rather, when Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party, he said to the Americans and the British and the Germans, listen, this is silly. We don't need to have this conflict. We've got nuclear weapons, you've got nuclear weapons. Why don't we go to a whole new way of understanding each other in the context of partnership? And if the West agrees not to move NATO to the east, what the Soviet Union will do is leave East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And we will allow Germany to be reunited. And that was an extraordinary, that was probably the most extraordinary act of statesmanship, maybe in human history, but certainly in modern times. I don't personally know of any other example in history, ancient or modern, where a leader has come up with a vision and on the basis of that vision for a greater peace, withdrew from an empire. Nobody forced the Soviets to withdraw. There'd been uprisings in Hungary in 1956, and Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in 1956. There'd been uprisings in East Germany, but that's the nature of empire. Gorbachev just withdrew. Germany was reunited. And the agreement was that NATO would not expand. Now let's just look at the map here. What happened? The Americans violated the agreement with Gorbachev. And beginning in 1999, with Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, under President Clinton, NATO pushed to the east. And then under Bush Jr. in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which now has a border against Russia, but Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovenia, and Slovakia, they were brought in 2004. The Russians, meanwhile, Yeltsin and Putin, all along had been saying we're no longer communist, but we don't want you expanding. We should be partners. And here's Ukraine, right here. And here's Belarus, right there. So if you look at this map, this is what happened in 2008. Remember, all this is geographically very flat. That's why the panzer divisions of Germany could get to Moscow in 3 months. There's no geographic impediment of any magnitude or significance from the Pyrenees. You have the Alps here with Switzerland. But other than that, this is a very flat geographic area. And right here, you've got the breadbasket of Europe. It's one of the largest wheat and food producing areas in the world. And the United States in May of 2008 announced that NATO was now going to take Ukraine, as well as the Republic of Georgia. And it was at that point that Putin, who up to this point, he'd been president for 8 years and Yeltsin before him, he'd been calling for a partnership. He'd been suggesting that Russia and Russia joined the NATO alliance and joined the EU because Russia was capitalist. But the United States was not able to move beyond the Cold War mentality and the neoconservative passion for war and militarism, and kept pushing to the east. So Putin said in 2008, if you start stabilizing Ukraine and try to force the Ukrainians into NATO, because at that time, Ukraine was neutral. And at that time, the leadership in Ukraine was pro-neutral and pro-Russian. So everybody was sort of stable. There was no war in Europe. But Putin said that if you destabilize Ukraine, I will retake Crimea. Remember what I said about geography in Crimea? Russia, as a great power, has to have Crimea to get to the Black Sea, to get to the Mediterranean, for all the trade, and out to the Atlantic. So one of the biggest naval bases in the Russian military is right there at the tip of Crimea, a city called Sevastopol. The United States continued to destabilize. In 2014, 2015, the United States engineered a coup that brought in a pro-NATO, anti-Russian leadership, and the Ukrainians began to bombard eastern Ukraine, which is 80% Russian. And that's why in 2015, Russia seized Crimea. And then in 2022, seized this land bridge. It's all geography. The westward expanse of NATO, as I put it in my various teach-ins, the irresistible force of US militarism and expansionism meeting the immovable object of Russian nationalism. And that's basically what's going on in Ukraine. I know many of you think that we need to be supporting the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are being unfairly hammered by the Russians. But I hope that when you understand this larger context of what's going on, that you have a sense of context that shapes what the Russians finally were forced to do in the face of the eastward expansion of the United States. And in fact, had Putin not done what he did, he would have probably been overthrown by the Russians. There is no way that any Russian leader would have allowed the United States to take over all of Ukraine, cut Russia off from a strategic access to the Black Sea. And if they'd taken Russia, the Republic of Georgia, completely encircle Russia on its western border. it wasn't going to happen. So when you think about Putin, you have to think of someone who actually had no other choice if he was going to stay in power and if he was going to ensure his legacy in the long history of Russia. He had to take Crimea. That's what geography dictates. Now, let me just make another quick point before we open it up. And that is just to point out the map from 1,000 years ago. This is geography 1,000 years ago, everyone. In the late 9th century, around 870, Kiev, see, here's Ukraine. But as I mentioned, Ukraine has never been an independent state until 1991, because it was always being invaded. It's always being gobbled up by somebody. The Byzantine Empire, in its heyday, controlled much of this. The Roman Empire controlled much of it. And then you had the various invaders. But in the 9th century, the princes of Kiev invited Vladimir of Rus, who was over about here, to come down to Kiev and become their king. He did that, and that began what they called Kievan Rus. So it's very important to understand that Russia, as we know it today, started in Ukraine. Ukraine is the mother of Russia. And you'll see that by the mid 11th century, about 200 years later, Kievan Rus controlled the Black Sea. They didn't control Crimea, because that at the time was controlled by the Byzantine Empire. That was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And that had stood controlling the Black Sea, for nearly 1,000 years. So the Byzantine Empire, here's what is now modern Istanbul, had controlled this area for a very, very long time. But over the subsequent centuries, first the Lithuanians came down. The Lithuanians came down and controlled this and took over Kievan Rus. And Kievan Rus migrated to the east and to the north. This is Novgorod. This is Russia today. This is Suzdal. This is Russia today. This is where Moscow would be, where my little arrow is. So Kiev and Moscow are very close to each other. So where Georgia is? I don't know, Georgia, you're about right here. That's where Georgia is, right there.
No, a little bit further down, Jim. It's Hungary is a bit further down. Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, that's Switzerland, the white one. And then you go to east. It looks like a chicken, that country. That's a chicken Hungary.
I mean, Georgie's right in the battle zone, essentially, because this is it's happening over here, but Georgie is in Hungary and it's very close. So that's what I wanted to point out, everyone, that the Russian soul was born in Kiev and Kievan Rus. So the Russians reclaiming that area in the face of Western US instigated expansionism is the most natural defensive move, again, dictated by geography, that one could possibly imagine. So everything that you're hearing about the Russians as the evil empire, everything that you're hearing about Putin as the great Hitler, everything you're hearing about war of aggression and expansion of empire, is completely propaganda. The deeper truth, as I've tried to point out, emanates from the truth about the history of that area and the geography of that area. And that is what we're now seeing played out. And the reason why it's so dangerous is that there's no indication that the United States has the capability to stop. The United States has not withdrawn from any war unless it's defeated. It was defeated by the Vietnamese. It was finally defeated by the Taliban. It was finally defeated by the forces in Iraq. But in this situation, the other power that the United States is seeking to conquer is as big as the United States in different ways and is fully nuclear armed. So unlike Vietnam, unlike Iraq, unlike Afghanistan or Libya or Syria or the Balkans, where the United States has come in and just crushed it, this time, the Russians are an immovable object. And they're reinforcing their position in Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of troops. And Putin has been clear from the beginning that he will use nuclear weapons before he withdraws. So that's why I say the irresistible force of US expansionism and US militarism is meeting the immovable object of Russian nationalism. And in the middle, Ukraine is being completely destroyed, senselessly. And the entire global order, which is so critical to dealing with urgent issues like climate change, is being dismantled and deconstructed. We could not be in a more dangerous moment than we are today in Ukraine. And as you know from some of my other remarks in different places, I'll put my blog in a minute so you can have the benefit of my blog and a video I've done. I've done a teach-in in the spirit of our Vietnamese teach-ins back in the 60s and 70s about Ukraine. It's really essential that we all understand what's going on. And we understand in terms of great books and words, I would just say that what you're being fed day in and day out in the mass media about what's going on is the opposite of what's truly going on. And what I've laid out is much closer to the reality than anything you're going to get on CNN or BBC News. They are supporting the march to war, and it's going to end up with catastrophe if we don't start a peace movement. And so on Humanity Rising, yesterday and today, I spoke about Ukraine. We're going to have a summit on Ukraine to mark the first anniversary of the war in late February, February 27th to March 3rd. And we're going to be having multiple summits on Ukraine. And so I hope all of you will pay attention to what's going on. Do not believe the propaganda of the mass media. I beg you. Look at the geography. Look at the map. And you see the reality of what's actually taking place. So anyway, I'll end it there. And I hope I wasn't too provocative to any of you who feel such strong support for the Ukrainians. I feel passionately for the Ukrainians. It breaks my heart that they're being destroyed as a country, as a people, and are being bombed into the Middle Ages. And had it not been for the expansionism of the United States, this would not have happened. So those of you who are Americans, we need to really internalize that the United States has some deep soul searching to do to rectify the damage that we've done on this planet, most recently in Ukraine. So now I will call on my distinguished colleague from Hungary, who's there within a couple hundred kilometers of what is really going on. So Georgie, comment in any way that you would like.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim, for another wonderful and very profound presentation. Yeah, well, I have lots of comments and try to be as short as possible because I'm sure that our attendees would like to talk with you as well. First, I'd like to refer to the points you raised about what makes a book a great book. And I love classical music, and somewhere I read recently that what makes music great, it makes the music great is the emotion or the thought that actually teaches you in your heart or reaches you in your heart. So I believe that a great book is somehow the same, that it really gets something out of you which is very, very unique. And I do think that this book is actually great because the word you said, relevant. And also the other word what I would like to use is because it is objective. Geography is objective, but history and politics are subjective, right? So I remember I was brought up in Hungary. I was brought up that Attila was great. He was like a hero, almost like a Jesus Christ. When I went abroad, I've heard that Attila, no, he was really an awful person. It's like, no way, he was a good guy. So you see, totally subjective, right? But geography is very, very objective. And I full-heartedly agree with every single word you said about what's going on in Ukraine and what is actually going to happen if something not going to change. This book, I really, just like you, highly recommend everybody to read because it was eye-opening to me. And I remember that last year when the war broke out, I was listening to so many alternative analysts, and they said the same thing that is written in this book. So clearly the mass media, that this is about power consciousness. And that's what I would like to say, that look at what has been going on in the past few hundred or thousand years. And I was reading the book, I was thinking, what has really changed? Not a huge amount, really. Europe is still being trespassed, just like Ukraine, Hungary, the Turks, the Romans, like everywhere. It is just like that. It's a huge melting pot, but it is really about power. This is the consciousness. This is the level of consciousness of humanity, which is very, very saddening to me. And also what I was thinking as you were talking, that how much pollution this is being created, not just mentally, but also to Mother Earth, and also all the trauma, right? So many of us, we're trying to work on the generational trauma, and more generational trauma is being created in Europe. Europe is full of these wars, okay, probably elsewhere as well, but now we're talking about this small continent. So that is really heartbreaking. I do know that since last February, over 1 million Ukrainians came over to Hungary. And Hungary is a small country. Budapest is only 1.2 million of population. So that's how many people came over. And they get full support of free healthcare, housing, travel, education for the kids, everything. So this is not a huge amount of people, just 1 million people coming over. But I also know that there is not a great amount of good reputation of the Ukrainian government in terms of treating minorities. So in the Donbas area, I know that, and I've been hearing this not just in the past year, but like the past 20 years or so, that they're badly treating Russians. And so they're badly treating Hungarians in the Carpathian area, which used to be, before the First World War, Hungary. So that the Ukrainian government doesn't acknowledge the dual citizenship. You have to be Ukrainian, or you can't be Ukrainian, Hungarian, or Ukrainian and Russian, and so forth. Now, because they want to join the EU, they have to change their rhetoric. They have to be nice to the minority. But we know that they're being oppressed. But I don't really want to really transgress from here. I'd like to say that Tim Marshall wrote another book, which is really wonderful. So do read it. And actually, I read it just last week, and it was interesting as well, that how he was viewing that the shift, the Russians being the baddies. In every movie, the Russians are always, no, the Chinese will be. So it will be different now, because China will be the big baddie against the American. But as you said, it is not just that if Putin didn't do anything, then the Americans would have pushed even further into Russia. because if there is a force, it has to be an anti-force as well. That's just physics, isn't it? And then something has to stop this really toxic American politics, because it is just toxic. Probably there are other words for that as well. But now I think this is where I would like to stop, Jim. Thank you very much. Let's turn to our audience.
Thank you, Georgie. I love your observation, which I hadn't seen as clearly until you put it, that history and politics are subjective, but geography is objective. It's a real important observation to make. Thank you, because that's the essential point that Tim Marshall is making in his book, that the maps don't move. People move, ideas move, everything moves except the map. That is what endures. So thank you for that observation. All right, you doctoral students, I want to see your hands up. I want to start with Laura Madsen's question in the Q&A box about giving more details about the American involvement in the revolution in Ukraine and when Zelensky became leader. So I'll answer that, but let's get your hands up so we can have a good interaction about these weighty matters. As I indicated, in 2015, essentially, you had what they called the Maidan revolution, where a pro-neutral, pro-Russian leader, Yanukovych, was overthrown in a CIA US-led coup, which was directed by then Vice President Joe Biden in the White House, and orchestrated by the US ambassador to the EU, I believe it was, Victoria Nuland, who's still very, very active. So Joe Biden and Victoria Nuland are still active in the whole unfoldment of what's going on in Ukraine. What emerged after the coup was essentially the United States brought in the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Now, to understand this, it's very important to go back a little bit in history and understand that Ukraine was the region of the world back in the 1920s and the 1930s of the most virulent anti-Semitism and fascism. When the Germans came into the Ukraine, they did not themselves kill the Jews. The Ukrainian fascists did. They were generated by a man named Santander. And he was just a fascist like Mussolini in Italy. And you've heard about the massacre at Babi Yar, where several 100,000 Jews were just rounded up and just slaughtered. That was done by the Ukrainian fascists. So the Ukrainians were the most willing of Hitler's executioners. After the war, those elements did not go away. And you may remember that the United States invited many of the former Nazis that were scientists, like Werner von Braun was a German Nazi. And he was brought to the United States, and it was because of Werner von Braun and the German scientists that the United States got to the moon. And many of them were involved in the nuclear weapons development of the United States. And similarly in Ukraine, the fascist elements, the Nazi elements, which in this case had the overlay of not only anti-Semitism, but virulent anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian nationalism. Because remember, at that time, Ukraine had never been independent. So there was a I want to use ferocious again. There was a zeal for Ukrainian independence. And they saw that as against Russia and they saw that as a highly nationalistic. And that's one reason why, as Georgie says, you can't have dual citizenship. In most countries in Europe, you can have dual citizenships, not in Ukraine. So what the United States did in 1915 is bring all those elements into the government for the first time. They immediately outlawed the Russian language, outlawed Russian culture, forbade any Russian studies in any of the schools. And in fact, if you look at the anti-Jewish laws of the Nazis in Germany in the 30s, the Ukrainian government passed similar laws, except it wasn't against the Jews, it was against the Russians. And they immediately, with CIA and American support, because remember, they're trying to destabilize Ukraine, and they're also trying to destabilize Russia. The ultimate goal of the United States is not just to take over Ukraine, it's to break up Russia. And everybody needs to understand that. And Putin understands that. And so does Xi Jinping in Beijing. The Americans are delusional about what they consider their capacity to reshape the world in the American image. So anyway, that began the wars in the Donbass, that part in eastern. I'll put the map up one more time so you can see it here. See, this is the Donbass here. There's Donetsk. This is the Donbass up into here. Here, Kharkiv. That's all the That's 80% Russian. And this is all Russian, 70, 80% Russian. So the Ukrainians started to bombard the Donbass in particular, right here, and obliterate the communities. And they were being led by the Azov Brigade. You've heard of the Azov Brigade in Ukraine. Those are the Nazis. Those are the neo-Nazi elements that have been at the forefront of Ukraine since the American-led coup in 2015. Now, they had a series of elections, and basically the western half of Ukraine voted pro-West, and the eastern half of Ukraine voted pro-Russian. So Ukraine was really split. So what obviously needed to happen was a coalition government and some kind of largesse. And this is where Zelensky came in. Zelensky was a comedian who didn't speak very good Ukrainian. He's a native Russian speaker. And he did a spoof on the situation. And it was so popular, people said, listen, why don't you run for president? So he ran for president on a peace platform. It's like if I ran for president, what would you expect Jim Garrison to run on? I'd run on peace, right? So did Zelensky. And he won in a landslide as a peace candidate. Then the Azov Brigade sat down with him, and the U.S. Embassy sat down with him and said, listen, buddy boy, that's not going to happen. You may be president, but we're going to war. And apparently, from what I've gathered, they threatened his family. And he immediately succumbed. And then the war broke out. And then he became this poster child. But initially, he wanted to, if you go back into the record, he wanted to negotiate. Putin wanted to negotiate, and the Americans said no. So Zelensky has become a tool of the American war machine, because this is not about Ukrainian independence. The United States has no interest in Ukrainian independence. What they want is a bastion of US, NATO nuclear forces right against the border of Russia, because their next objective is to break up Russia. You can even see maps back 20 years ago when the neocons were starting this eastward expansion of NATO. They had the intent of breaking Russia up into 5 separate countries. Now, why do they want to break up Russia? Because Russia, in terms of commodities, is the richest country in the world. Of the 100 different strategic minerals and assets you need for a super industrial economy, Russia has 98 out of 100. The United States is actually poor in terms of those strategic minerals and assets. And that's one reason why the US has such a vast military machine, because it's scooping up all those resources from the rest of the world. Russia doesn't have to do that. So instead of partnering with Russia and creating a common market with Russia where these goods and commodities could go back and forth, the United States wants to break up Russia and bring in the multinationals like it's doing in Ukraine. Right now, the big agribusiness corporation and the GMOs and Monsanto poisonous fertilizers have basically bought up Ukraine. That's what's going on. This is not about liberation of Ukraine and supporting the Ukrainians against the Russians. This is about securing the breadbasket of Europe for the US agribusiness corporations and the US military industrial complex as it seeks to expand and continue to ensure global supremacy for the United States. And one of the reasons why this is so intense, to make a final point, is the Russians are saying no. That's that immovable object I was talking about. Iraq couldn't do it. Afghanistan couldn't do it. Vietnam couldn't do it. Libya couldn't do it. All these wars that the United States have fought are against people who couldn't stand up against the United States. Russia can. And Putin has made it crystal clear. They are not going to give up what they've taken, and they'll use nuclear weapons if necessary. And still the US won't stop. It's taken all of it. It's taken all of Eastern Europe. The United States now controls all of Western Europe and Eastern Europe except Ukraine. You know, it reminds me, to make a philosophical point that I want to hear from others. You know, in Faust, Goethe's Faust, Faust makes this pact with the devil. And he's given all kinds of power, wealth, prestige, and he has everything. And one day he looks down and he sees a little old couple, Philemon and I forget the name of the wife. Dear old couple. They're working on a small little plot of land, and they're living alone. They're not hurting anybody. They have goats and chickens and cows, and they just are living their lives. And Faust can't stand it that he doesn't control that too, because he says, if I have that, I have everything. That's what's going on in Joe Biden's mind. If I've got Ukraine, I've got everything. And Faust proceeds, go down and kill the old man and woman. And that is when the plot turns and Faust is destroyed. And I believe that Ukraine will be remembered as that milestone where Pax Americana reached its outer limit and collapsed. Because I believe that what's now emerging with Russia and China and India and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Iran and Brazil is a coalition now that's capable of undermining the United States in a very, very serious way. And it was done last November when the Saudis announced that they would no longer, OPEC, the oil producing economic consortium, would no longer sell oil, which is the most traded commodity in the world, exclusively in US dollars. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to take a moment on this because this is really important for all of us to understand, particularly all of you Americans. You remember that back in 1972, President Nixon took America off the gold standard. Well, what he did simultaneously, without telling anybody, he and Kissinger, who was Secretary of State at the time, cut a deal with the Saudis and said, if you trade oil only in dollars, we will protect you in perpetuity, even against Israel. So the US in 1972 went from the gold standard to the oil standard. And for the last 50 years, the strength of the US economy and the US dollar has been attached to the cornerstone of oil. That all just went away. So Putin, the Chinese, the Saudis, the Indians, the Iranians, the Emirates, the South Africans, and more countries are joining this OPEC plus coalition against the United States, and the US dollar has just gone free flow. So when we think about geography and we think of history, we need to really bear in mind that it's very fluid. And just as Faust killing those poor old people, just so he could have a little sliver of land, but he wanted it all. That's what's gripped the United States of America, and Ukraine is that moment when striving to have it all, it may destroy the world, but certainly it is the death knell of Pax Americana, because a new coalition is rising up that can take us on.
Jim, would you allow me just one quick thought?
Please, please.
Thank you so much. I'd like to say that besides the points you raised about that why United States would want to break up Russia, I would say that unity is stronger, right, than being small little states. United States doesn't want a united Europe, right? So this whole war actually weakens Europe as well. Okay, yeah. So that's why America very cleverly came up with this idea that let's just kind of like get Europe and Russia out of this whole equation, so Americans can just have this greater greed. This is all about greed, isn't it? Greed, but there is limits to everything. We know from sciences. It has to be some kind of locked up, and this is where the Chinese is pushing back and Putin is pushing back. But poor people, not just the Ukrainians, but all around, suffering so much.
Thank you for raising that issue. That's very important. You remember the sanctions. The sanctions were supposed to punish Russia. The sanctions didn't punish Russia. Russia just found other trading partners. The people who were punished were the Western Europeans and the people in the United States with excessive inflation and economic dislocation. There was a speech in the German Bundestag 2 weeks ago by one of the ministers saying that Germany could become a dysfunctional state because of what's going on. And what did the United States do? They said, well, we'll sell you your oil and gas at extortionate prices. And in fact, it was so extortionate that Macron and Scholz in Germany had a press conference where they said the United States is being extortionate. The United States doesn't care about Germany any more than it cares about Ukraine. What it cares about is the extension of US military supremacy.
Control. What you
Control.
said, control, total control.
Total control. And it's got all of it now in Eastern Europe, except that one little last place. And it's driving the Americans crazy. And anyway, any more questions before we wrap this up here? There's one that might be a good point to end it here. Leo's asking, is there a way to read history other than political power and subplots? Well, there's many ways to read history. There's the history of the women's studies, where they're now emphasizing the role of women in history. There's people's history. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. What I've just given you is a different geostrategic history on Ukraine. So there's many ways of understanding history and politics, for the reason that Georgie mentioned at the beginning, that history is subjective, intensely subjective, whereas geography is not. And I think that's a good point with which to end our session today. The absolute objectivity of geography, which doesn't change, and the intense subjectivity of human politics, human history, human economics, which change day by day, year by year. So that'll do it for today. And then next time, I'll be lecturing more on the geographic realities in Latin America and in Africa and in the subcontinent of South Asia. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you a month from today. Remember, it's the second Tuesday of every month we meet for this graduate seminar. Really appreciate your attention. Bye-bye. Thank you, Georgie.